You're going to hear from three excellent speakers today. We have Ashley Young. She is a human and animal rights activist and the sister of the first law enforcement officer to be charged with terrorism. He has a very unique case. It's very disturbing. And a shout out to his attorney, who is awesome, who's in the audience today. Really lucky to have him, Nick Smith. Next, you'll hear from Kathy Manley. She's also an attorney, and she's the legal director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, and also a member of Project Salam, based in Albany, New York. And then third, you'll hear from Murtaza Hussein. He's a journalist with the Intercept, who is extremely prolific. He writes about these national security cases almost always. Anytime I'm curious about a case, I see his byline, because he's written about it. So I think we're going to have a great discussion.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, me. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So I'm the co-director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. I'm the daughter of a former political prisoner in the United States, and my name is Lina Narian. My father is a former political prisoner, Samuel Narian, who was a professor in Florida. So some of you may have known about his case. He was one of the first major terrorism, his was the first major terrorism case post 9/11. But he was acquitted and eventually deported. So without further ado, Ashley Young.
Okay. Yeah, so my brother was arrested almost 2 years ago now, on August 3rd, 2016. Police officer in DC of the Metro Transit arrested on charges to support, material support to terrorism in the form of $245 worth of Google Play cards.
Worth of what?
It's a gift card, Google Play gift card. So I actually, it's funny because one of my best friends, the day that my brother was arrested, she sent me what Google Play card says on, if you Google what a Google Play card is. And it says, Google Play gift cards allow you to purchase the music, movies, TV shows, books, magazines, and apps and games you love. Unlimited access to millions of songs. And she said, so I don't understand what happened. Did your brother just buy ISIS a bunch of apps to get Taylor Swift CDs? What is happening? Nick would be the first law enforcement officer in the United States to be arrested on charges of terrorism. He's charged with providing $245 worth of Google Play gift cards to a paid undercover informant posing as a friend who had been in his life for several years, who pretended to join the Islamic State, a decision that my brother had adamantly advised against. The exchange of the gift cards capped an undercover investigation into my brother involving at least 6 years of federal government deception in multiple failed sting operations beginning in 2010 or earlier. So it started the furthest thing back that involved the FBI with my brother's a Muslim converted in 2006. So at the time of his arrest, he had been Muslim for 10 years. At the time of his arrest, he had been a police officer for 13 years. So we found out that the first time that FBI was ever spoken to about my brother was in 2008. Actually, someone from his workplace called them. My brother had a dispute with with the seniors of the police department over the length of his beard. He thought that Muslims should be able to have their traditional, if they want to, within a certain length. So he went on this little dispute with them. And also he had a Quran.
Newspaper clippings about cases like these were on his workspace desk.
Yeah, so they called, and he traveled to make Hajj, and they thought a bunch of officers didn't like that he had converted, traveled, they were talking bad about him. So that was what was so suspicious about him, that someone felt that they had to inform the FBI, which is nothing to do with terrorism, it's just being Muslim. Then in 2010, a man named Zachary Chesser was arrested, pled guilty to charges of terrorism. His case was the guy who threatened the South Park creators. He had a website with a bunch of radical stuff on it, and he urged people to go after the South Park creators because they made cartoons of Muhammad or something. So Nick had met this guy twice on a college campus in 2009 for community events, Muslim student organization community events. He spoke to him in passing. Hi, how are you? The kid, he was a lot younger than my brother. He asked him about joining the cadets, going to the academy. My brother said, if you're interested, just give me a call, I'll tell you all about it. My brother has no idea this kid's going online, making a website, talking about weird, radical, whatever, extremists go attack South Park, whatever. He's arrested, this kid's arrested a year later, and that would be the first time that my brother is spoken to, interrogated by the FBI. So the FBI also went to my mother's house, knocked on her door, said they were from his police department, said Nick had been missing, do you have the phone number of his wife? And my mom said, what wife? And goes, oh, well, he's been overseas and you know he got married, so I guess you weren't invited to the wedding. This is all a lie. So my mom freaks out, calls my brother goes back to Metro and says, what the hell are you guys doing at my mom's house, freaking her out, making her crying hysterically? And they said, oh, that was actually the FBI. So then they contacted the FBI and it said, hey, Nick wants to talk to you guys. That would be his first, the first time he spoke. So that was September 2010. By December.
And he did that without a lawyer?
Oh yeah, he spoke to the FBI many times without a lawyer. He couldn't stop speaking to the FBI. But it happens all the time. I spoke to a ton of my brother's friends who, they just talk to the FBI without a lawyer all the time. They just think, well, if I don't have anything to hide and I'm not doing anything wrong, I'll just speak with them.
Yes, they can.
Yeah, but they also don't know that an FBI agent can lie to them, but you're not allowed to lie to the FBI. And a lot of times the meetings, interviews aren't recorded. They're written summaries that the agents write. But also I think a lot of times Muslim men think that if they do contact a lawyer, that it will make them look like they have something to hide and that they're scared, and so they think it's just easier to speak with the FBI.
I think that's for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, true. But so this gentleman named Khalil, he was an undercover FBI agent, so not a paid informant. He was in my brother's life from 2010 to 2012. And the agent testified at trial. So we took my brother's case to trial. We called the entrapment defense because he basically went for 6 years with zero criminal activity. And he walked around DC with a gun as a cop. So if the FBI was really scared that he was a threat to our national security, that would have hopefully never happened. But so Khalil testified in court behind a screen, so you can't see who he is. He testified he and Nick hit it off right off the bat. It seemed like they had been old friends. They were comfortable with each other. Their conversations just went really well. They met at a wedding. They were both attending the same wedding, so that's how long this man was in the community. Khalil's investigation would show nothing against Nick. Nick did make some comments that sounded violent, and that was used against him. But Khalil testified in court, although the prosecutor tried to get him to say, Nick had a plan. Didn't he have a plan? Khalil said, you know what, he did not have a plan. He was joking sometimes. Sometimes he was just talking about hypothetical stuff. This is 5 comments over the course of their 2.5-year relationship. So a lot of times the undercover was wearing a wire, and if there was a group of men and one man was saying something that sounds radical or unpopular, they actually chastised Nick in court for not saying anything. They said, oh, and Officer Young just sat there silent. And it's like, so not only is he being prosecuted for things he's said, on 2 different occasions they chastised him for things he didn't say, just being silent while other people are having conversations. Khalil, the undercover agent, who my brother had a great friendship with, picked up and left, and my brother never heard from him again. Now, in between this time would be when he was approached, I believe, twice in person, twice over the phone to work for the FBI. First, they offered him a full-time job. And then after that, he said no. He loves his work. He does love his work. He was a great cop. He worked for 13 years with 0 complaints against him. He never had to touch his gun. He never had to use his pepper spray. He never had to use his taser. One of the communities that he patrolled called him officer friendly. He loved his job and he was great at it. He was going to retire from that police force and be a beat cop the whole time. He didn't want to sit at a desk. He wanted to be out in the community. He was totally against the new police style, us versus them. And it was more important for him to help someone than to have authority over them. So this is the kind of cop that the communities need. And it's unfortunate because he was pulled away from that. He didn't even have a complaint about rude behavior in 13 years. So the FBI then said, no, I love my job, I'm gonna stay a cop. They said, okay, well, we might have part-time opportunities for you. Something a little bit more sexier than what you do. That's what they said, a little bit more sexier. So they proposed to him that he go in as an informant into mosque and spy on groups of people. Not targets. My brother asked them specifically, would you be telling me what criminal activities this person's involved in that, they're a target? And they literally told him, no, you'd just be gathering information on groups of people. Basic information, where they lived, who they lived with, who is in their home, who they're married to, who they're friends with, who they're sleeping with on the side, stuff like that. My brother 4 times told them no. He found it distasteful. Of course, in his personal conversations, his language was a lot more
Colorful.
colorful than distasteful. So directly after that would be when the paid informant in 2014 entered his life, and eventually the person who said he was going to go travel overseas and who asked my brother about 3 times to send him Google Play gift cards so he could communicate. The government said he asked for Google Play gift cards to recruit new people to ISIS. My brother says that's not his intention. And they have like 2 sentences at the very last text messages where my brother goes, this is for people to communicate with their families. And then the last text message from the informant. And of course, at this point, the informant's phone is being handled by multiple agents. And they said, no, this Google Play gift card is going to be used to recruit people from Sudan. And that was their last sentence to each other. 2 days later, Nick was arrested. So what Nick Smith started getting to is they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that in 2010, before the undercover agent came into his life, that my brother had a predisposition to materially support terrorism. When they raided my brother's house, they found a bunch of Nazi stuff. Clothes, books, memorabilia, collector stuff. The agents who raided called the prosecutor and said, we don't know if this is within the scope of the warrant. Can we pull this stuff? And he said, yeah, go ahead, do it. And at the beginning, we're like, oh my God, all that stuff is gonna get thrown out. Even my brother had guns. He had a lot of guns. We've been shooting guns since we were kids. His guns, we were like, these are all gonna go out because the crime that he committed isn't violent. And also, why is the Nazi stuff there? It's not a hate crime. So the stuff that they got from my brother's house, he studied European history in college. He took a class on racism, European racism, and some of the books were literally from bibliographies in his college papers, which he holds on to everything. So I was able to find reports and the syllabus of this class. He made an A- in it. And it was within my brother's studies of his minor that he got attracted to being a World War II reenactor. So he is one of these people going out. We used to make fun of him for it. I'm like, you're such a nerd. But he did it for like a good 8 years. And it's part of the National Reenactors Society. They have great mission statements. They preserve artifacts from the time period. And my brother is one of the guys who dresses up as the enemy. During these reenactments, they performed on military bases and everything. So they use that kind of stuff to say that my brother is a neo-Nazi. He's a Nazi, he's a neo-Nazi, he's a white supremacist.
That's what the government say.
Yeah. What did I say?
You just stated it as facts.
Oh, yeah, okay. So they're saying
He's none of those things.
he's none of those things. They don't have any evidence that my brother held ideologies that would be any of these things. In fact, 2.5 years that he was under investigation, he was dating a Jewish girl. And they know this. In one of their interviews, they asked him, oh, you would marry someone who's not Muslim? Speaking about her. And he said, yes. Like, this was the love of his life at the time. But so the prosecution before trial says, we are calling in an expert witness. This man, his name is Dr. David Gerenstein Ross. He claims that he was born Jewish, converted to Islam, was radicalized within a year, and now he's Christian. And now he's an expert on radical Islam.
Wow.
So he writes a report. The government pays him $16,000 to write a report specifically for my brother's case of why white supremacist white supremacist radicalization would lead someone to be radicalized into militant Islam. This is true, and the judge let this in.
Without any findings on the record, with
Yeah.
no voir dire of the witness before taking the stand.
So, I mean, we tore the witness up in cross in trial. It was, I said it was like painful to watch. I said, oh my God, if you go in on him anymore, it's gonna be inhumane. He had never been, I think I have it written down, on our cross of him. So the case is now hinging on this idea, this conspiracy, that neo-Nazis and white supremacists would lead someone down the path to militant Islam. So on cross testimony, he acknowledges that there are tons of white supremacists are racist and that hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world are ethnic minorities and non-whites. And so basically, why does that make sense that a white supremacist would convert to Islam? So it came out that he's never testified as an expert in any case on this connection between white supremacy and militant Islam. He's never testified in a criminal case at all. He does not have any peer-reviewed publications on his thesis that there's a connection between white supremacists and militant Islam. He's never had any peer reviews on the subject at all. His writings on the subject consist of 2 popular press articles, he says. Those 2 articles were published on the
Bill
web.
Bristol's magazine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
you gotta finish up.
Okay. Yeah, so basically we just tear this theory apart, which should be enough on its own to say beyond a reasonable doubt, no, this man was not predisposed to support militant Islam, because look how desperate they're getting, and they had to bring up Hitler in a terrorism case. And the jury, unfortunately, didn't see that. They'd been a whole week of basically a public lynching of my brother, a character assassination, and the emotions behind both Nazis and terrorists. I believe our arguments, as strong as they were, weren't strong enough to get through someone's emotions. My brother was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison with another 15 years of supervised release. In that court circuit, that sentence of 15 years is more than, that's me. That was my 25 minutes.
Continue.
But that sentence is longer than people get for manslaughter in that district. I think it's a third longer than manslaughter in that district. But so our appeal is due on the 21st of this month, and we're moving forward with a very strong, aggressive appeal. It is our conviction that this case will not hold up. We didn't want it to get to this level. We didn't think it would get to this level. We thought Nick would be the first person to win an entrapment case on terrorism charges in the United States, and that didn't happen, so we're going to appeal.
Hi, everybody. I first got into this stuff through a case out of Albany, New York, which is where I'm from, case of Yasin Araf, who was entrapped in a sting operation, arrested in 2004, trial in 2006. There was no evidence. He didn't even know anything illegal was going on. I'm not going to talk about that really because I don't have time. I want to talk about other stuff, but that was what opened my eyes to these kinds of cases and how unfair they are. He was convicted based on secret evidence, based on what we found out later was a misidentification. That's why they targeted him. But the judge told the jury that there were good reasons for targeting him. The judge told the jury this. And so they were afraid to acquit him even though there was no evidence in the sting. Like he never said anything bad, he never did anything, nothing. But he got convicted, got sentenced to 15 years. His time is up in October and he's gonna be deported back to Kurdistan in Iraq. But so after that case, Steve Downs was here and I started and some other people, we started looking at other cases and kind of studying this. And we started Project Salam in 2008, and then in 2010, the Coalition for Civil Freedoms that we're all from was started, and we started studying 300 cases in particular that the U.S. government said were terrorism cases, domestic terrorism cases. They were all Muslims, they were all convicted, and they said they were all terrorists. And so we were like, well, Yasin's on this list. We know he's not a terrorist. What about the other 299? Let's look at them. So we studied them pretty intensely, and we came up with a framework, actually Steve came up with it, but it was based on the government strategy of preemptive prosecution. The idea that like Dick Cheney said, if there's a 1% chance that somebody might someday in the future decide to attack us, we have to go after them first. And so this was the strategy of the FBI post 9/11 in particular, to go after anybody they were suspicious of, and they were very suspicious of Muslims. So they went after these people based on their religion and or their political ideology, their political beliefs. So out of the 300 cases, we found that 72% were what we call pure preemptive prosecution. The people did not commit a crime at all. They were either entrapped and manipulated into a sting operation, or they were charged with material support for terrorism without any evidence of intent to support violence. But you can do that under the material support laws, or other things like false statements charges that then get the terrorism enhancement, so they get a longer sentence, like when they're talking to the FBI. 94% of the cases had what we call elements of preemptive prosecution, where maybe there was some fraud crime, some maybe drug crime, some kind of crime going on, but because they were Muslim, maybe not very strongly Muslim, or they wouldn't be involved with the drug crimes, but anyway, because they identified as Muslim to some extent, they were treated much more harshly, and there was this aura of terrorism, and maybe there was a claim that the money that they were making was being given to terrorists, or that there was an intent to do that. Anyway, they got treated much more harshly than they would have been if they weren't Muslim. And so that's 94% of those cases. Only like a handful of cases, 4 people out of the 299 at that time. Now this was 2001 to 2010, so we need to update our report. A lot's happened since then, but at that time only 4 people were involved in acts of violence or even attempted violence within the United States, and another handful overseas. Most people were not connected to any acts of violence, and yet they were called terrorists by our government. And so we studied that, but today I wanted to talk about the manufactured plots and thought crime sting operations, like Ashley was talking about with her brother. And one of the worst examples happened here in New York City. The trial happened, but it was the case of the Newburgh 4. I don't know if you've maybe heard of it. It was a few years ago, probably 8 years ago now. There were 4 young, not young, some were younger than others, but anyway, 4 African-American men from Newburgh, New York, who weren't even really Muslim. They had sort of converted to Islam in prison. They had been in prison. They didn't know each other much before. They weren't in prison together, but they had all been in prison. And what happened was the FBI took the same informant from our case in Albany, Shahed Hussein, and sent him to a mosque in Newburgh, New York, this small impoverished community, and he was supposed to look for terrorists. There was no evidence that there was any terrorism going on connected to that mosque, and there wasn't. And the FBI claims that they don't just send informants to go into mosques and infiltrate without a basis for it, but they clearly do, and they did. He spent a whole year in that mosque without getting anywhere, and as a matter of fact, pissed people off because he was acting kind of strange. They kicked him out. He was hanging out in the parking lot like a year later when he met this con artist named James Cromedy. And they started trying to con each other, because James is like, Shahed Hussein's like, oh, I'm this rich Pakistani dude with these fancy cars. He had like a BMW, and he said he was a terrorist and all this stuff. He's like saying, oh, I could help you, James. And James is like, oh yeah, I'm a terrorist too. Yeah, right. Oh, I did all this stuff. I went to Pakistan. And he didn't. It was all fake. Like he totally was lying, as he always intended to do. So Shahed Hussein was like, oh good, I got a live one here, I can work with this, the FBI loves this kind of stuff. And so he worked on him for quite a while, promising him all this stuff. Finally James got sick of it because it wasn't really helping him, and so James wasn't talking to him for a few months. And then finally they get on the phone again, and Shahed Hussein says, listen, brother, I promised you $250,000 and you don't want it? And James is like, oh yeah, I'm in. He didn't even have a driver's license. He didn't have a job. He didn't have anything to his name. And yet he's being promised $250,000. And if that isn't entrapment, I don't know what is, right? But at the end, he got 3 down-and-out friends of his to agree to be in this so-called plot, getting paid $5,000 each. Now these guys had no political beliefs. They weren't really religious. Shahed Hussein, who didn't know much about Islam, didn't know the 5 pillars, he was supposed to be teaching them about Islam. These guys did not know much, and they were really kind of down and out, hapless guys who, one of them was severely mentally ill. He was just wanting some chicken out of it, like that's what he said. Like he couldn't even do anything that they were trying to teach him how to do. Like they were supposed to wire these cell phones. They just said, all right, you just be the lookout, just go stand there. Like he was really a sad case. But you would think that would be a good entrapment case because these guys had no predisposition, clearly. And under Jacobson, as it used to be, you need predisposition. But what happened, and I don't know, maybe this doesn't apply in Virginia, but up here, there's this thing called the ready response standard, where post-Jacobson, if the people don't back out of the plot before they get arrested, then that shows that they must have been predisposed. So that counts as predisposition. So you don't actually need predisposition. So therefore there is no entrapment defense, right? That's why nobody's ever won on it. And these guys got convicted despite the strong entrapment defense, especially with James, who was the so-called ringleader, but he was the one that was offered $250,000 after he had backed out, came back in. They were all convicted and sentenced to 25 years. There's been a lot of other cases since then, and a lot of times the government will target mentally ill or otherwise vulnerable young men. There was one man out of Boston who was pretty seriously mentally ill, who was even wearing diapers because he couldn't, and it was because of his mental condition. And he wasn't eating. He was really having a really hard time after he had gotten an engineering degree, but then his life kind of fell apart. He had some drug abuse. Anyway, he was targeted by the FBI and manipulated into being this informant became his best friend when he didn't really have any friends, and he just really fell under his sway. And then finally when the guy, and he was he was supposed to be making little remote controlled devices that would supposedly drop a bomb, little tiny drone things, like remote controlled helicopters. But he was just really not well, and when he finally went to a psychiatrist and started taking medication, the FBI was like, uh-oh, he's not going to be with us anymore doing this stuff. So they swooped in and arrested him right away then and charged him with material support to terrorism, attempted possession of an explosive device, something like that. And he got 23 years. I worked on a clemency petition for him in 2016, which never went anywhere. It's still pending. But there's a lot of people like that who are mentally ill. Some of them were even found not competent for trial. And if you know anything about the competent, you can be really, really mentally ill and still be found competent for trial. Some of them were not found competent for trial. One of them recently, and this was a different kind of case, but he was convicted of wanting to go to join ISIS, and he was convicted after trial. He had no contacts with anybody in ISIS or anything. He just wanted to go. But he wrote the judge a letter saying that the judge should buy a yacht for the defendant's wife because then the defendant won't worry about her while he's locked up. And he sent him a bunch of yachts. So that was the condition that this guy sent him, pictures of a whole bunch of yachts that he could choose from to buy. It's really sad, when they target people like that. Instead of, if they're worried about them, there's a lot of other things they could do, like get the mental health treatment. There's also this idea of when you look at what the informant did to convince the person, you have to look at all the contacts that they had, and a lot of times it turns out that you don't know about the early ones. You only, after it gets to a certain point where they've manipulated them to a certain point, then you start seeing the recordings.
Yeah, that's
before
what
that happens in all the cases, right? Before that, who knows what happens? You hear about what they say, they gave me gifts, they did this, that, they befriended my children, all this stuff. But that's never part of the trial, that's never recorded. It only starts when they think they've got you to a certain point. And so this is used pretty much to target Muslims, but it's been used to expand beyond that to other communities too, to a certain extent. During, you may remember, during Occupy, and there was a group that was connected to Occupy Cleveland that was anarchists that were entrapped in a sting operation, and they were also pretty down and out, unemployed, had some drug addiction issues, and this informant invited them to live in this place and gave them work, and then got them to be involved in this plot to bomb a bridge in Cleveland. So, and then they were convicted and given not as long sentences as the Muslims, but around 10 years maybe. And there was also people connected to NATO protests in 2012 that were entrapped in a similar plot that were also, I think, anarchists. So there's also for what we think of as First Amendment protected speech. Doesn't apply too much if you're Muslim or otherwise, or African American. In this recent case, this guy who was called the Black Identity Extremist, he was on Democracy Now! The other day. He was he's from Texas, Dallas, Texas. His name's Rakem Balogun, and he was a member of a group called the Huey Newton Gun Club. I mean, everybody in Texas has guns, so, you know, why not black people too? But that's looked at a little differently. So he was targeted for things that he wrote on his Facebook. He wrote things like, oh, cops will get what's coming to them. Things, nothing specific, no specific threat or anything, but things like that, like people say all the time. And he got targeted by the FBI and was locked up for 6 months, but they couldn't build a case because they couldn't charge him with material support, because in order to be charged with material support to terrorism, you have to have some kind of, supposedly some kind of connection with a designated terrorist organization, and they didn't have that. But they locked him up for 6 months and then let him out recently. But so some people do not have free speech the way you think you're supposed to have it. And as far as the material support laws too, there was a case, I think, I don't know when it was, Brandenburg case, on that you have a right to be a member of the Communist Party or a member of any group, right? You can be a member, so technically you can even be a member of like ISIS or any group, but you can't because when it's a designated terrorist organization, which is just the government chooses which groups, which violent groups they like and which ones they don't like, right? Because I mean, you got the good Kurds and the bad Kurds. One got the DTO designation and the other group didn't, that the US was giving money to in Iraq, versus the Turkish Kurds, the PKK, right? They're basically the same people. But so if it's a designated terrorist organization and you provide material support to it through resources such as yourself being a member, then that's illegal and you can get 15 years in prison for it. So you can't really be a member of it. You can't even write an op-ed in the newspaper about how this group is trying to peacefully work out their differences. Like there was this group called the Humanitarian Law Project that was trying to help the PKK and also the Tamil Tigers at the time to like have peace negotiations, and also like with the FARC there were people that were targeted. But because all these groups were designated terrorist organizations, nobody could do that kind of work and be free from the threat of being charged with material support for terrorism. And if you're Muslim, forget it. Like there were people that were charged with material support who weren't even coordinating with an organization. Like the Tariq Mahana case out of Boston. This guy basically was translating things that were written in Arabic and translating them into English and putting them online. So he wasn't even writing this stuff himself. He was just translating it and putting it online. And he was charged with material support to Al-Qaeda under the theory that by putting it on the internet, somebody from Al-Qaeda could download it. So they didn't even have the contacts. Like, so, and he got convicted and sentenced to like 17 years, I think. So you don't really have free speech if you're in certain groups or connected to certain groups. Let's see. Well, I wanted to mention a couple of movies, and then I'll probably stop because then we'll have more time. But about the Newburgh case, there's a documentary called The Newburgh Sting that you can find. It was on PBS. It's really good. It goes really into that case, and that was a really extreme example of a case under Preet Bharara, who now people talk about wanting him to run for Attorney General. Bad idea, but anyway. There's another movie that we were connected with called the Terror Movie, T with the T in parentheses.
It's fantastic.
By Lyric Cabral and David Sutcliffe. And it covers, it's really fascinating.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
It won a Emmy, I guess, whatever that word.
It's on Netflix also.
Yeah, and it's on Netflix. Yeah. You can look it up, but basically it films kind of an ongoing sting operation in Pittsburgh because Lyric, who we knew her from the Newburgh Case. She was a documentary and photographer person. She ended up befriending this guy who turned out to be an informant for a long time, a former Black Panther who was an FBI informant. She found out he was. She talked him into going with him on his case and like filming him when she could, and so she was doing that
Without telling me.
without telling
Yeah,
the
the
FBI,
FBI
without telling us. We didn't know. We got contacted at Project Salam by the target, Khalifa Al-Akili, who said, I think the FBI is trying to entrap me, because the informant that they sent in at the beginning, turned out to be the end, was Shahad Hussein from our case. And Khalifa was already suspicious, so I'm kind of giving away parts of the movie, but oh well, still watch it.
Spoiler alert.
He asked for Shahad Hussein's phone number, and he gave him this phone number, and he Googled it, Khalifa Googled it, and it was the same phone number he had in the Newburgh case. And what came up on the screen was the conversation with James Cromedy about offering him $250,000. And it had Shahad Hussein's picture, because we had his picture, it was on in the New York Times. So Khalifa had proof, this is who this guy is. And so we totally blew the whistle on the sting, and we said, are you sure you want to go public with this? They're going to try to get you somehow. They're going to really get you. Oh, no, they can't get me. There's nothing they could get me on. Well, he didn't mention that he had a couple of prior felony convictions, and that he had gone to a public shooting range, which you wouldn't think would be felon in possession of a weapon if you go to a shooting range and then take a picture of it. But it kind of is under the law, as bad as the law is. So that's what they got him on. The sting fell apart. They told the informant that was with the filmmaker to get out of town. So they're driving up towards Albany when they get my email blowing the whistle on this from Khalifa that I sent to everybody. So Lyric gets this, and she says, oh my God, this is great. Now we, basically because they were introduced to the target through us, through that email, she then started filming the target too. And the FBI didn't totally give up on it yet. It kind of fell apart, and they kind of did. But she was filming, I guess she might have even started filming him before that. But anyway, she's filming him too. He doesn't know she's filming the informant. The informant doesn't know she's filming him. It's a great movie to watch.
The past several years, someone has contacted me, someone in the United States, a family member, friend, activist, or lawyer, someone related, connected to somebody who's been charged with terrorism offenses somewhere in the U.S. And as you know, they're not terrorist attacks every few weeks in the U.S. They're very rare. It's only been about, in the last 16 years, about 100 people have been killed in terrorist attacks in the U.S. total. Because over the last 20 years, the definition of what constitutes terrorism in the U.S. has been broadened very precipitously. And as Kathy was talking about, it hinges around this idea of material support. In 1994, this law was passed establishing the idea of material support for terrorism being a crime. And what that law did in effect was it criminalized a very broad range of activities which had nothing to do with violence. And as Kathy was mentioning, speaking out on behalf of a banned group, so supporting them in some sort of tangential way, which is very open to interpretation. And actually, this happened pre-9/11. It didn't have to do with the idea of terrorism as we think of it today. It was very much tied to the Palestinian issue. And this perception that in the United States, Muslim American organizations were supporting Palestinian militant groups which were in conflict with the Israeli government. And the initial prosecutions under material support were all around this issue. And they also tied back to an investigation which again predated 9/11 by almost 20 years, called vulgar betrayal. And it was an investigation into Muslim American groups which continued for many years, didn't result in any convictions, but it was a very intensive COINTELPRO type investigation of their activities. Now when you fast forward to 9/11, you entered what I think was the first era of terrorism prosecution in the US. A few weeks after 9/11, Bush went out onto the White House lawn and he gave a speech naming several dozen charities and civil society organizations which were having their assets frozen and were being connected in some way to the 9/11 attacks. Over time, we came to see that none of these organizations had anything to do with 9/11. They weren't connected to Al-Qaeda. They're totally separate. But this was the first salvo in a a wave of prosecutions which targeted people who in many ways were the elite or the pillars of the Muslim community in the United States. They were academics, they were heads of charities, activists, civil society people, owners of large businesses, very educated people. And they were very much targeted by the FBI and law enforcement organizations and the press, and associated with terrorism. Some of the very high-profile cases you may remember: the Holy Land Foundation, Mercy International is one, Save the Children. People who ran charities were sent to prison for many, many decades, and they're still in prison. These cases were conducted very sophisticated means of surveillance, infiltration of organizations with informants, pressuring people to cooperate with the government or facing any number of consequences. And for about a decade, with some exceptions like the Newburgh Sting and the 465 case, which the Intercept was written about, these were, if not the norm of terrorism investigations, they comprise a very significant chunk of what we considered terrorism cases in the US. Now, over the last several years, I think there's been, with the advent of these new terrorist groups and proliferation of social media, there have been, I think, a new type of terrorism cases predominated in the US. There have been also not really associated with violence, but they've been more targeting individuals who are not the pillars of the community, but they're very marginal to the community. And in many cases, they're very vulnerable people. They are people who are mentally ill, young, indigent in some way, maybe struggling with drug abuse or criminal histories. And they're targeted not through mainstream organizations and physical surveillance as much, but it starts online. So we have many cases where people are young, they're posting online, and they're befriended by informants, or they're befriended by FBI agents working undercover. At the height of J. Edgar Hoover's administration in the FBI, there were about 3,000 informants working in the FBI. As of 2008, the last updated figures we have show there are 15,000 informants working in the FBI today. And that number has surely increased many times over the last 8, 9 years since it was revealed. So you have people trawling online, looking for people who are making posts, and engaging them in conversation. And these conversations, it's very hard to draw the line who is leading the conversation here, especially if it's a very young person or somebody who, as mentioned, may have mental illness or maybe some way very troubled. You have, over the course of many months, sometimes over a year, them becoming friends with people online, oftentimes multiple people, and all these people are working for the government. And they have a job, which is to make arrests. Their job is not to dissuade you from doing the bad thing or talking to your parents about it or somehow diffusing the situation. Their goal is to generate a case out of this. So in many cases, they effectively are encouraging people who would not or could not carry out an act of terrorism on their own because they're not able to, because they simply don't have the capacity, or they didn't have this thing called predisposition, which is very difficult to establish, and as was mentioned in the conversation earlier, is not really necessary for these cases any longer. So there are a couple of cases I want to talk about in particular because I think that they really speak to this phenomenon. There's hundreds of cases, about 148 cases since 2014, and several hundred cases before 2014, before ISIS and so forth. But I think they're very emblematic of this phenomenon. But a year and a half ago, I got a call from a woman in Arizona, and she mentioned that her son had been arrested on terrorism charges. Her son had been arrested actually 2 weeks after his 18th birthday. His name is Maheen Khan. And Maheen Khan is someone who, I asked medical records, I talked to people who knew him. He had the mental capacity of someone much younger than 17 at the time this investigation was reaching its peak. He was probably a mental capacity of someone closer to 11 or 10. He couldn't tie shoelaces. He couldn't really go to school. He didn't have any friends. He was in and out of mental institutions. And he actually first came to FBI attention when he was 15 years old, because he'd sent a threatening letter to his teacher, and he'd been checked into a mental institution. FBI visited him there. They continued visiting him at his house. And there is this perception, which is very pronounced, which the FBI works to cultivate, that when they first approach you, they're not there to get you in trouble. They're your friends, and your kid is in trouble, and he was in a mental institution, and we want to talk to him, just make sure he's okay. So they actually continued meeting with this kid for years up to the time of he was arrested. 15, 16, 17, they were in very close contact with him. And over that time, his older brother passed away of cardiac arrest. His mental state actually depreciated more. And his parents were, unbeknownst to them, the FBI agents who were meeting, they were actually building a case against him to eventually arrest him for something. And his parents didn't trust him because he was very volatile, so they didn't let him have a cell phone. They tried to, as much as possible, keep an eye on his activities. And the FBI agents meeting with him secretly bought a cell phone for him so they could continue communicating with him and said, don't tell your parents about this, but we want to keep in touch, so keep talking to us about X, Y, and Z. And he did keep talking to them, and he was saying things later on, talking to the informant, talking to the agent, saying, I want to support the Taliban, I want to do this and that. And really unhinged conversations, which when you see the transcripts of them, or you see the excerpts of them, they're not someone who's well. And what the FBI did is they continued talking to him, and then they waited until 2 weeks after his 18th birthday to arrest him. Because as you know, after you turn adult, you can be charged with much more serious crimes than you would beforehand. Throughout all this time, they didn't make an effort to diffuse the situation by talking to his parents, who they also knew, who they met at his house. They just wanted to make an arrest out of this case. And when I first saw the case reported, as many of these cases do, you just see the headline. You see the headline is that terrorism arrest in Arizona, he plotted to do X, Y, and Z, as some attack, a violent attack somewhere. And I find that the overwhelming majority of these cases, not to be pejorative to reporters in local jurisdictions, they just rewrite the FBI press release. They take the FBI press release and they reword it a little bit, and then that's the report. And then there's no more reporting after that. That's kind of the end. So there's another statistic for a terrorism case. People are panicked and terrified by what happened. It adds to the general level of toxic level of discourse and fear existing in the country. Someone goes to jail, and then that's it. And then the press release becomes a story. That was very much the case in Mahim Khan's case. We reported about that. He got, I would say, less time than most people in these cases. I think because there was a little bit of embarrassment that people wrote about it ultimately. He got 5 years, which I think is still a lot, and comparable to other cases where people have very low cognitive function and mental illness at a very young age. I think he got more. There were some comparable cases people didn't get time, or a few months of supervised release, things like that. He still got a pretty harsh sentence. Now, a few weeks ago, or last month, there was a very similar case about a young man in Plano, Texas, named Mateen Azizi Iran. So he was posting online. He was 17. He was posting online, talking about, maybe I want to go to some territory where ISIS lives and live with them because, whatever. And he's talking about this to someone who's also an informant. And they were having conversations for several months, and then the informant introduced him to another person who was also an informant, and they introduced him to a third person who was also an informant. I think 2 of them were informants, and one of them was an FBI agent. One of the informants, made arrangements to come to visit with this young man in his hometown, and they walked around, they talked about things that they could have done. And, he was making also very troubling statements. He was sort of flip-flopping back and forth between leaving the country or carrying out an attack in the United States, neither of which he seemed to really have the ability to do because he was also being scrutinized by his parents, and he was also very young. And, over the course of several months, he sort of built a network of people around himself who were these informants. And this was later described as an ISIS attack or ISIS plot. He was never in touch with anyone from ISIS. He clearly was someone who was very disturbed and had some very troubling views or troubling predilections on the internet. But, when you're a young person, you're very susceptible, and all these adults are surrounding you on the internet and also physically coming to meet you, you can become very, you can develop a predisposition you didn't already have. Because when you're very young, it's proven that your brain is not developed to a certain level that it would as an adult. So he sort of became the central node in this galaxy of people around him who he thought were ISIS but really working for the government, and they arrested him in May. Now, when they arrested him, his parents came out and said, you know, we didn't know what he was doing on the internet. Like, we didn't have any idea. We tried to monitor him. We tried to keep tabs on his behavior, but we didn't know he was talking to people on the internet saying this. We're shocked, etc., etc. And I think his case really speaks to, he also was charged in state charges. So a lot of terrorism cases generally tend to be federal, and the FBI is involved. They want federal prosecutors involved in this. There's two circumstances that I would say where state charges become the norm. It's when federal prosecutors just don't like the case. They think the case is not really worth pursuing. Maybe it'll be a bit borderline or embarrassing, or they can't really justify it to their colleagues or whoever else that they took part in this. And then they recuse themselves for that reason. The second reason, which seems to be the case in this young man's case, because the federal prosecutor released a statement about it, they said, well, we didn't want to prosecute it because, you know, in Texas, 17 is an adult, so he can get a lot harsher sentence this way. So we're going to let the state prosecutors do it because we want to hammer him a lot more. So I think that this really speaks to something like these two cases. When you have someone who's young, how do you view them? Like, if you someone who's young, and it's the case with Black and Latino people too. Do you view them as a super predator or potential super predator, or somebody who should, like, really is an animal and needs to be kept out of society and, like, put away, and we should do this by any means necessary? Or is it someone who, you know, we steer in the right course or make efforts to at least, like, tell their parents before we're going to trap them, or involve the community, or some alternative to prosecution which, you know, in Azizi Iran's case could be in life in prison? I think they very much veer in these cases towards treating them as an animal to, you know, take out of society by any means necessary. So they're trying to actually do everything they can to put them away for as long as possible, even though these are cases where no one was in touch with ISIS, no one was harmed, the person is very young, minor, but no, they view these cases extremely aggressively. And I won't be cognizant of time, but there's also career benefits for people involved in these cases, because it's very glamorous to have these terrorism prosecutions on your resume. And there's a case we did at the Intercept, which I think is emblematic of this, because it entails somebody who later went on to try to run for national office, which is Chris Christie, which was the case what he was very famous for, really helped make his career, the 4-5 case. 4-5 case happened in 2008. It was these Albanian American guys and one Palestinian American guy who were involved in this purported plot to attack Fort Dix military base in New Jersey. Now, you know, we did a story about this in Intercept. It's a very comprehensive story. There's also a short film about it, which you can find on the Intercept's website, which summarizes it. But effectively, these guys their personal circle was infiltrated by informants. The informants spent 18 months hanging out with them, befriending them, just doing all types of shooting the shit, hanging out, that type of stuff. They weren't able to find any plot. There was no plot of anything with these guys. And at trial, the judge sentencing them, about to sentence them for life, said, you know, there wasn't really a lot of evidence in this case, but it didn't bother the jury, so it doesn't bother me either. This is like a verbatim quote before sentencing them. And they got life in prison in ADX for this plot.
ADX is like the most
The worst possible prison.
Yeah,
Yes,
like
yeah.
solitary,
Like
really.
where Timothy McVeigh
Yeah.
was, who
Yeah.
actually killed people.
Yeah. So this is the case again. There was no connection to terrorism groups. There was no plot. No one was harmed. But they got exponentially more than rapists or murderers get, and I think particularly egregiously in this case, in many cases like this. But the guys didn't know about the plot. The three Albanian guys in the thing, they didn't know that there was some other guy had talked to the informant and said this. And the prosecutors and judge didn't even try to say that was necessary for them to know about a plot. They just were around. And in these cases, it's almost 100% conviction rate. Like, recently, there's a case of Noor Salman who was acquitted of this case, which is very rare, and I think part of it, the reason is because there was a lot of national scrutiny on the case. But there's not a lot of...
Can I interrupt? For those who don't know, she's the, okay, you know, all right. Well, she's the wife of the Orlando nightclub shooter, Omar Mateen, the Pulse nightclub. Do you want to like just tell them briefly?
Yeah, Selena helped us.
No, don't tell them that, but tell
I
them like
wanna-
what she was accused of and what they did to her.
Anyways, she was the wife of Omar Mateen. She was a victim of his domestic violence, and she also was very much his victim, and she didn't know anything about this plot, or she didn't know anything about what was going on, and they just needed to put someone away for this case, because unlike the vast majority of terrorism cases, people did die in this case, and I was shocked they acquitted her of these charges, and I think it's because the case really. I think this is the case, and the vast majority of cases, when you scrutinize them even a little bit, the whole thing unravels.
Say Brady violations, right?
Brady violation, yeah, of many different things. Informants. Yeah, it's just like, even reading the government's version, the affidavits the government releases, if you just read it line by line, it's just like, this is like ridiculous. It's like the informant's doing the whole thing, the guy is completely incapable of functioning, he doesn't know what's going on, and no one reads the affidavits. The most basic minimum you can do, reporters don't read them, and this is the government's narrative. This is not even incorporating the defense narrative. So her case, it's very gratifying that she was acquitted. But these Vortex guys, I think that their case is probably one of the most egregious cases in the U.S. And they all got life, and it really destroyed their families. 3 brothers, can you imagine? Like 3 brothers all put away. Very hardworking family, very sort of would have been like an American dream type family in different circumstances. They're really ruined. And Chris Christie made his career in that case as a prosecutor. And there are many prosecutors that are eager to make these cases. Because
Barim would have been, except he was too young.
Barim would have been, the one other brother. They want to get him too. He's just too young to involve him. So yeah, there's just not incentive to question it. There's not incentive to really acquit them or care. The press is not scrutinizing them. It's just a churn of these cases. And I want to just conclude by putting things in big perspective. There are some legitimate cases here and there. There are some cases where there is a need for people, or they could have been justified on some basis of law enforcement being involved. But those cases, of the several hundred cases post 9/11, they're very, very few and far between. The thing is, without the steady drumbeat of these spurious cases, they cannot justify the national security state which exists now in the U.S. And there was a study released earlier this month, or last month, by the Center for Public Integrity, finding that since 9/11, there have been $2.8 trillion spent on counterterrorism in the U.S. Just counterterrorism, never mind the wars, just on counterterrorism. And in that time, there have been 100 people who've died from jihadist terrorist attacks in the U.S. In that same time, in 2016, 20,000 people died just from opioid use, from fentanyl use alone in the U.S. So it's $2.8 trillion. That money is being disseminated out to law enforcement, to hire people, this whole world of think tank people getting paid $16,000 a report to talk about the Nazis. It's just this huge terrorism industrial complex which can only continue existing out of these spurious cases, out of these informant cases. Because if that stuff went away and these stories went away, people would ask, where's our tax money going? Why are we spending so much money when there's other things happening, when there's almost statistically a nil amount of casualties from these attacks or these cases? And it can't be justified without that. And also this terrorism industrial complex, they generate so much mental attention on this phenomenon that you start thinking the only violence happening are these cases. Like this case, every once in a while, this is violence. And then it helps you ignore the background violence, which also has existed, wrapped up precipitously in the last 15, 16 years, which is violence of the wars. Those just become like background noise to reality. Like violence, terrorism, when it happens, we notice that, and then everything else is just business as usual. It's just the weather. So I find that these cases, they serve a purpose on the micro level of just scaring people, helping make their careers, but also on the macro level, there's an ideological purpose, and there's a justificatory purpose for people's budgets and for foreign policy. And yeah, I think that is how these cases, why they continue in the absence of any legal or moral reason.
Over there, you basically talk about the 10 points of the Bill of Rights. So each of these cases touches upon different aspects of the process of law, but one has not been touched upon, and that is the jury. And I'm kind of wondering if there has been any evidence of jury tampering from the government in any of these cases, jury selection or jury planting of people, because you do have informants. And I'm kind of curious if that portion of the process has been even covered or even suspected.
They don't need jury tampering.
That was
Yeah.
exactly
They're
what
just-
The jury tampering is by the Washington Post article, or the fact that in Yassine's case that the judge tells the jury that there's good reasons for targeting our client, and it's a climate of fear, he's a Muslim with the beard, he's from Iraq, that's all they need.
But jury instructions do matter sometimes
Yeah,
during the.
Oh, they matter, yeah, but I mean, I don't know about like jury tampering,
Right,
or like in
it's
the,
just something-
Sacco and Manzetti case or something, we haven't seen that.
Yeah.
Like we had the judge was asking the questions to the whole group of jurors, which is problematic because people have to answer in front of all the other potential jurors. So people will either lie or if they feel uncomfortable. That's why doing it by paper is a more diplomatic way to get truthful answers. But we had someone in our jury pool, she asked, has anyone seen media on this case? And one guy stands up and goes, yeah, I heard about his arsenal of guns.
Right.
And at that point, the guns weren't supposed to come into the case.
Right.
And it was she didn't care, okay. Well, you just told the whole potential jury that you heard about my brother's arsenal of guns.
By the way, just to tell you the irony of this line of action by the government, in my father's
The courts
case,
don't care.
who was accused of planning or financing mass murder, what did they take? My dad had two guns.
yeah, I
I
love
think
this.
one of them was literally in a box. He never opened it. It was like a rifle. The other one was a revolver. On the first day of trial during opening statements, our attorney, the late Bill Moffitt, has a giant picture blown up of the guns that the government left in our house, in the picture of the books that they took. And he said, this is a violent mastermind. Why did they leave the guns then and take the books? So, I mean, it's entirely arbitrary. It's just a matter of whatever theory they want to advance about you. But, all right, yeah.
I have a question. It's maybe more of a procedural question. I can't stop thinking about the expert who testified in your brother's trial. And I don't know what the standard is for excluding expert testimony in a criminal trial, it's civil. But if he's someone who didn't publish anything on the topic.
He shouldn't be an expert.
Yeah. And did anyone file that motion? Maybe
sure
a
they
Extensively.
appeal?
He did extensively.
Okay.
We did too, and we
Right.
had Evan Coleman, who's a well-known, he's called a Google expert on the appeals, by the appeal judges at the oral argument, because all he did was look up stuff on Google, and that was the source of his expertise.
Yeah,
And
our-
he testified in a
our
whole bunch of
expert-
cases now.
Our expert pulled up blog posts. He referenced, or their expert referenced materials from blogs.
In Russian,
In,
which you
yeah,
can't read.
in Russian. And so he said, I used a translation service. And we said, which translation service would that be? He said, Google Translate.
Yeah, I mean, the Daubert standard
Yeah.
doesn't apply in these cases
Oh.
at all. It should, but it doesn't.
The courts are letting it, they're the gatekeeper and they're
Yeah.
letting it open.
Right.
It's the judges.
And our
Yeah.
judge even said, oh, I'm not gonna be a gatekeeper. Like, the law says you're supposed to be. Oh, no. Just let the jury decide. That's what he said.
They actually didn't mention too, but in that case, the Nazi-ISIS connection, the argument was also that in the 40s, this Palestinian Mufti had met Hitler.
Grand Mufti.
The Grand Mufti had met Hitler. So this actually was the argument that
Yeah.
there is a connection because look at the Mufti, he met him.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a picture of the Mufti on his laptop,
And there was a photo of my brother in traditional Muslim garb, which was
That's the prosecutor's phrase, was traditional Muslim garb.
traditional Muslim garb, and then my brother also had a photo of himself in his reenactment uniform. And so they said, those two pictures of my brother is the convergence of the two ideologies, just like Hitler and the Grand Mufti.
How many other cases are out there that are plea deals?
Most of them are.
Right, so that's what I would figure. If you have basically 298 conviction rate to 299 cases, right? So how many other cases are we talking about? Are there hundreds, thousands? How many?
No, I'm counting those. Those are part of the ones that pled are part of the cases we studied.
Oh,
The majority of the ones that we
Is that a
studied
sample size, or is that the
That-
total
that-
number of cases that
that-
are out there?
is the number of cases that the government called terrorism cases between 2001 and 2010, those 299. Since then, there've been a bunch more, which we have in our database. We have to update our report and analyze them and run the statistics again. A lot of it's linked to ISIS cases, and most of them do plead out for that very reason, that they're gonna get less time, they're gonna get convicted anyway, almost certainly. Some people have, well, a lot of them, you think they have good defenses, and some, you know.
Yeah. I mean, with my brother, there's no way he would have let out. You know, so then you do have a population of men who say, I don't care,
Right.
I'm not gonna plead.
There was a conspiracy case in Toledo, they recently all pled out.
Right.
And the average cost to defend against these cases, I know you probably haven't run those numbers, but what would you say that is?
I
You
mean,
mean
it
to
depends
hire
how much
lawyers?
work they do.
Yeah,
on
well,
it.
you can either have basically
Right.
an assigned attorney, and if anybody
It was
knows
a
anything
lie.
about, anything knows anything about the
My
court
father's lawyer
system.
was $1 million.
Yeah.
We raised the money around the country.
Yeah, in our case, the classified evidence thing is a big sore point because the lead, I did not even try to get a security clearance because that was not going to happen based on my history of activism and civil disobedience. But the lead trial attorney, Terry Kinlan, he got one just to look at this evidence and never got to see any of it because the standard, I mean, it wasn't going to be given to the jury, but it was all given to the judge and caused the judge to tell the jury there were good reasons for targeting him, which we found out later was based on a misidentification with Yasin with somebody who was killed in 2010 that they thought was him. But, you know, that was only because we got it on FOIA years later while he's sitting in prison. But we never got to see any of it because the standard is you don't get to see it unless it's called favorable to the defense. And the judge is looking at it going, well, wow, they say he's a guy named Mohammed Yasin in Al-Qaeda. That's not favorable, so I'm not going to give it to him, so we can't investigate it and show that it's false.
And
The
you
judge
don't-
just believes
and you
it.
can't- and you don't know what's
It's an
in it, so you
adversarial
can't-
system. It's a total Sixth Amendment
Yeah, you
violation,
don't
but
know
they
what's
don't
in
care.
it, so you can't argue
We
to
didn't
the
even get
judge
to
why
see
you need
any of it.
Yeah.
Does the jury get to see?
No, they didn't get to see it. There was some cases where they do, and a lot of other stuff
Maybe the
happens, but
grand
not in this
jury
case. But it
sees
polluted the judge, so he made all these rulings against us and told the jury how, you know, this is a bad guy. Yeah.
I didn't know about any of these cases until my brother was arrested. Literally none, zero, no reference whatsoever, okay? So the first thing you can do as an individual, just being a person, is go onto the website, the Civil Freedoms website, and sign up for the News Digest. It comes out twice a week, and it
Well, once a week, yeah.
once a week, and it highlights these cases. So
It's really good.
you as an individual person, start reading some of them. You'll notice right away, you'll pick up on, things that are happening over and patterns and stuff like that. The first thing to do is just pay attention, and it's not happening around you, so you have to seek it out. To your social media and engage people in conversation. These conversations don't happen, right? Most people don't want to talk about terrorism cases. It's even just having an open dialogue about it. It's been going on since, 9/11, that's 17 years ago. And my brother's case started 2 years ago, and you see this very small group of people who care a lot. They care a lot, but it doesn't do anything. It
So-
needs to be at least a lot of people who care a little bit to
Another
get something going.
Thing you can do is if we would love to come speak to any group that you may be connected to, if you know any group, church groups, whatever kind of group, we'll come speak probably, hopefully if it's within a few hundred miles of us, but yeah. So
And
we're always looking for that.
Yeah, and if there's a case in your area, take time to show up to one of the hearings.
Right.
Be a neutral third party, get ears on the ground, just show up and listen, because nobody's listening. And the Muslim community is they shy away from it. They don't want to be involved in it. So it's hard because it's also a lot of secrecy among the community. And then how does a community tell other communities about it if they're not even talking about it to their own community? So pay attention to cases that are in your area and take a day to show up in court.